Is there any support in the Greek, the language of the Greek New Testament, to support that Jesus is God? Well, a couple of weeks ago, I talked about John 1:1, and you can go back and take a look at that video. But in this video, I'm going to talk about one other important Greek construction that does demonstrate quite clearly that Jesus is God. Let's get into it. Hey there, I'm Daryl Burling from Master New Testament Greek, here to help you with the tools, habits, and system to master the Greek of the New Testament. If you're interested in learning how to read the New Testament in Greek and even look at some of the constructions like we're going to look at today, then download my free roadmap to mastery at masterntgreek.com/roadmap. I'd love to be able to serve you. That'll just give you an overview of what the process looks like. So a few weeks ago, I published a video on this channel talking about how John 1:1 demonstrated in Greek that Jesus was God by talking about something called a predicate nominative. If you're interested in that, go back and take a look at that video, which you'll find by clicking the link just up here. Now, this time what I'm going to do is show that there are other grammatical constructions that we have in Greek that do the same kind of thing. And the one we're going to look at today is called the Granville Sharp rule. Before I get into this video though, let me just make a comment. There are a number of people who seem to be attracted to this channel who want to argue that Jesus is not God. Now, of course, it's a free world. You're welcome to argue that Jesus is not God. But I want to encourage you, if you're going to comment on this channel, please keep it civil. Engage with the material we're talking through. Don't resort to ad hominem attacks and things like that. Just keep it civil. Let's talk about the issues as we see them and be civil to one another. I think this is just, if you claim the name of Christ in any way, we should be able to disagree with grace. And that's what I want to encourage you to be able to do. And if you're interested in more on that, I did do a video talking about how to disagree with grace. If you're interested in that, you'll find a link to that video up here as well. It's really a book review more than anything else, but nonetheless, I think it's helpful. So from my point of view, I believe it's really important that we understand the deity of Christ, because if we don't recognize that Jesus is God, then Jesus is a human being. And if Jesus is a human being, then he is bound with sin like the rest of us are. And if he has sin, then he cannot be a perfect substitute for our sin, which means that we cannot be saved through his death, which means then that we can only be saved by Christ and works, or Christ and some other thing, right? And this is, I think, where you end up going and where all false religions that deny the deity of Christ end up going. Christ is not sufficient and we need to add something to him to be saved. So we believe in him and then we do some sort of work. So it's super critical to the central doctrine of the atonement that we believe and understand that Jesus is God. So the subject we're dealing with today is a really important subject, and it's important that we get it right. So who was Granville Sharp? Well, he lived in the late 1700s, died in 1813. He was a friend of William Wilberforce, and he was a key proponent of the abolition of the slave trade in England during that time. Now, he was also involved in politics in England, but also, and lesser known, is the fact that he was actually also a biblical scholar. Now, when we use that term biblical scholar here, he was actually, as far as I understand, he was self-taught. He wasn't taught in the universities. He was just a man who loved the scriptures, who went and learned Greek, and then as he was reading the New Testament, he discovered this rule that we're going to talk about today, which was named after him, and it's called the Granville Sharp rule. So the argument of this rule is that when you have the article followed by two substantives, that is a noun or something standing in the place of a noun, that are connected with the word kai, they are both referring to the same thing. There is some degree of unity between them. And there are really three different degrees of unity. One could be that there's, just these two things refer to something where they overlap in one another. It could be that there's equality between them, or it could be that the two things are identical. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on today. However, before we get into this, there are a couple of qualifications for this rule. In fact, there are really two main ones really. First of all, it doesn't apply to plurals. It only applies where the two substantives are singular. Secondly, it doesn't apply if one of those two or both of them are personal names, okay? So it only applies if they're singular and they're not personal names. So we're looking at things like descriptions of office, attributes, references to dignity, some sort of properties or qualities referring to the same individual, okay? And again, it's often very clear in the context that these two refer to the same individual. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. So for example, in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 21, we have Tychicus, the beloved brother and faithful servant, okay? So we see here in this construction the article, very easily there, and then we have these two nouns. Now with these two nouns, in this case you see the kai in between them, but you also see that they also have modifiers, the beloved brother, okay, and the faithful servant. And that's perfectly okay and valid within the Granville Sharp rule. We're not looking just for the article, noun, kai, and then the article again. You can have modifiers in between these, and that's perfectly legitimate. So in this case, then Tychicus is described as both a brother and a servant, and then we have brother and servant both have modifiers on them, a beloved brother and a faithful servant. So it's clear in this case that both brother and servant both refer to Tychicus. There's no question about this, nobody debates this. This is a perfectly agreed on construction. Another example here then is Revelation chapter 22 verse 8. And I, John, the one hearing and seeing these things, okay, and so really here we have John is obviously the subject, but then we have ha'akuon kai blepon telling us something more about John, namely that John is the one hearing and seeing these things. Okay, so here we have two nominative participles in this case. So remember what I said before, it's a substantive, so it could be a noun or something standing in the place of a noun. So here we have participles, adjectival participles, standing in the place of the noun, functioning as a substantive in this particular case. So the participles here are both substantive in function, and so you can see here the one hearing and seeing both refer to John, right? Again, there's no question about this. It's very obvious from the context, and so we can see that this construction here is being used where these two terms, these two substantives, are being used to refer to the same person. Another example, Philippians chapter 2 verse 25. This time it's being used of Epaphroditus, and we have three terms connected by kai, and we also have at the end of that we also have mu, this modifier, right? So Epaphroditus, the brother, the fellow worker, and the fellow soldier, my fellow soldier. And in this case, my is modifying the last of these three, not all of them, but nonetheless we see that it's still perfectly adequate, and nobody debates that these three terms all refer to Epaphroditus. Now there's a whole bunch of examples we could look at here. I'm just sort of picking and choosing a couple just because they're clear and they help you to see some of the variations. So in each of these cases, the important thing to take away is that we have the article followed by the two substantives, or in the case of Philippians there are three, connected by kai, and in every one of those cases we can see very clearly they're all referring to the same person. Now, before we get in and talk about the fact that this also applies to Jesus, let me just ask you, if you're getting value out of this, to hit the like button, and if you haven't already done so, hit the subscribe button and the bell. That way, when new videos are released, you find out about it. And if you hit the like button, it really does help other people find this video helpful. So, let's talk about how this applies to Jesus. There are a number of times in the Bible, in the New Testament, where we find this construction applied to Jesus. Now, there are a number of times where this is a little bit disputed as well, and there are a couple of times where we find this construction, but it's used with words that could be construed as proper names rather than offices. So there's some debate around exactly when this does and doesn't apply. However, there are two examples where it's very, very clear. We're going to deal with just one of those today, and that is Titus chapter 2, verse 13. But you could also look at 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1. And I think also Jude verse 4 is also another really good example of this as well. But there are a textual variation there, and so it's a little bit less clear. So let me switch over to the computer, and I'll walk you through one example of this. So, remember, of course, the rule I just mentioned, the article preceding two singular substantives connected by kai. You can see here, we have the article, we have our substantive theo, which again is referring to God. We have kai, and then we have soteros, savior. So in here we have, let me just translate this for you, waiting for the blessed hope and appearing of the glory of the great God and Savior of us, our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. Okay, so that's the translation of this text here. Let me just quickly walk through here. You can see I've got the red to highlight the Granville Sharp rule. The blue here, these two are just modifiers. So megalo is great God, and hamon is our Savior. Okay, so then we have this Jesus Christ underneath here, right? And the idea of this is what's called apposition. So it's standing in the place to identify who the previous clause talks about. It's in the genitive, which tells you that it's further defining who this genitive construction, this phrase here, refers to. This is called apposition, and it's because it identifies, often you can translate this great God and Savior of us, or our great God, the great God and our Savior, Jesus Christ, namely Jesus Christ. So Jesus Christ clearly then is who we're talking about. And this is very similar to what we saw in Ephesians 6 verse 21, where we're talking about Tychicus, namely the beloved brother and faithful servant, which is to say, which we saw before, which again, this is the other way around. So before we had Tychicus, and then we had the Granville Sharp construction in apposition to that. Here we have the identification of Christ in apposition to the Granville Sharp rule. So it's very similar construction, just flipped around the other way. Now, there are some different views on how this verse breaks down, but this is simple enough for us to understand. So the idea here is that if these referred to different people, so if we were talking about the great God and the great and our Savior, as if these were two different people, then we would expect to see the article between kai and soteros, but we don't see that here. So again, as we've seen with all these other examples that I've given you, this construction, when we see it here, refers to the same person. And again, I think the construction of this here with the apposition in the genitive makes it clear that this entire genitive construction that we have here also is the same person being referred to by Jesus Christ here. Okay, so this is made really clear through this apposition, and this is really a classic example of where we see Jesus Christ being called both our Savior and God. Now, if you agree that Jesus is our Savior, you end up, based on this construction, you also have to hold that Jesus is also God. If you believe he's God, he's also Savior. So those two things both refer to the same person. So let me switch back. So the answer to the question is that yes, the Greek does help us to see that Jesus is God in a number of places in the New Testament. And what we've seen today is really just one sliver of the argument for the deity of Christ. And I want to encourage you, if you're really interested in this, and it doesn't matter whether you disagree with me or whether you agree with me, I would encourage you to go do some serious reading. Let me give you 3 books that I think are helpful to work through this. The first one of these is Putting Jesus in His Place. This is a great book. It's a scholarly book, but it's really quite a simple approach. Really what they do in this book is they show by the honor that Jesus gets, by the attributes that are ascribed to him, by the names Jesus receives, by the deeds that he does, and by the seat that he occupies, that Jesus is in fact God. This is perhaps the most comprehensive argument for the deity of Christ that you can get in a single book perhaps, and I haven't surveyed every book on this subject, so I could be wrong there. Another book that I recommend is Murray J. Harris's very good, let me rephrase that, excellent Jesus as God, and this is an exegetical book designed to walk through the Greek specifically to explain how Greek argues for this position. It includes the passage that we've talked about today and other passages such as 2 Peter 1 verse 1 as well. And then thirdly, there's a book called Pierced for Our Transgressions, which really contains in it the argument that for penal substitution to be valid, we need a perfect Savior. We need God to become man so that we can be saved through him by his grace. So that's some books that I really would strongly recommend you read. And again, if you haven't done a lot of reading on this and your knowledge is just internet knowledge, then I encourage you, don't risk and don't rely on the internet. Don't rely on what I say. Go read some of these books. Read the text in the Bible that they refer to. Follow their arguments and make your own choice based on that. I think the arguments are compelling, but that's just me. What do you think? I'd love to hear from you in the comment section below as well. Share your views. Again, keep it civil. We should be Christians, right? So we ought to be able to disagree with grace. So keep it civil, but share your views in the comment section below. I look forward to hearing from you there. If you are interested in learning Greek and doing more on this, then please download the roadmap at masterntgreek.com/roadmap, and I look forward to seeing you there as well and being able to serve you perhaps by helping you to learn biblical Greek. With that, thanks so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Until then, keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery. See you then.